Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Chairman of the AVRDC board, Dr. Wang, members of the boards of directors, you're all very welcome, our guests and all of the staff and our friends. We're going to have a very good morning this morning, and we're first of all going to listen to Dr. Tony Simon. He is a man who I have known for quite a few years, perhaps not intimately, but quite a few years, and he served with me on the Deputy Director General's Committee of the CGIR. When was that? 2008, 6, 7, something like that. And he established a reputation of being a thinker that was unafraid to speak his mind in forthright terms. He's no politician. He's actually a graduate from the University of Massey in New Zealand, which is in fact probably New Zealand's foremost university, I think they would claim that. He then got a proper education at Cambridge, both master's and PhD level, so there's some quality here, we're happy about it. He's also worked at Oxford. He's a man who's been heavily involved in public and private partnerships. He's worked in the private sector at one stage in time. He's a professor of Agroforestry at the University of Copenhagen, which is a great honor for a non-Dane to be named in such a capacity. And we interacted together when he was at ICRAF as a very senior scientist working on trees and fruit. And it was perhaps no surprise to me anyway that in 2011 the ICRAF board in their wisdom decided to make him the Director General. So I have every confidence in what we're going to hear is going to be interesting and stimulating. Tony, the floor is yours.
The lighting is okay? Would you like to change? Good morning, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank Dr. Wang, the chairman of the AVRDC board, Dyno and Jackie, and the board of trustees of AVRDC for inviting ICRAF to be part of your celebrations and also allowing us to sneak some fruit into your vegetable larder. The title of this morning's talk, Making Landscapes and Livelihoods More Fruitful. And why would we be discussing fruit in AVRDC's 40th anniversary? Well, I think fruit and veg are most closely associated, both in marketing terms, in dietary terms, and in a lot of the production systems of the smallholders of the tropics that we seek to work with together. If you take AVRDC's budget, and you take the proportion of ICRAF's budget on fruit, it's probably combined about $25 million a year. And that's probably less than a quarter than the world should be spending on this endeavor. So how are we going to play catch-up? The discussion I'd like to have with you this morning involves 6 things. Some words on development challenges, where we were 40 years ago with fruit, a few facts about fruit trees today in the tropics, some examples of fruit tree species improvement or domestication, and lastly, a few thoughts looking ahead to more fruitful landscapes. To development challenges. Are the Los Angeles city commuters and the Cairo city populace and developing country poor independent of each other? Or are they differentiated problems? Or are they linked global challenges over time? All of that productive base that we're talking about when we talk about fruits and vegetables comes from the land. And I would like to this morning focus a little bit on Africa because we've heard a lot about Asia, but not exclusively. So in Africa, we know from the latest World Bank report that by 2030, we will be needing to spend up to $20 billion a year to tackle land degradation. So isn't it worth spending a little bit more on fruit and vegetable production to help arrest some of that? Because if we get it wrong, this is what happens. It takes 100 years to build 2 centimeters of topsoil. And we can lose that in a single rainfall event. Not only that, and this is probably the scariest slide I'm going to show you this morning, and it looks at the overlap between land degradation and child mortality. So the darker the hatched areas, the more degraded they are, the darker the circles, the higher likelihood your child under the age of 5 has of dying. Up to 80% are the dark red dots there. And that is scary. That is really worrying, that coincidence between land degradation and the chance of your small child dying. Which is why when we look at the landscape level, we've spent a lot of work looking at surveillance science and land health metrics. How do we measure the health of our land? Because our current tools and processes, such as the early FAO soil maps that look like this, are those like paint-by-numbers things we did when we were children. We painted in different colors. So if we zoom into a 20 by 30 kilometer area, such as here in eastern Ethiopia, we see in the middle an alluvial soil, to the right an alfy soil, and to the left a shallow rocky soil. But how does that help a government, a farmer, subnational district manager, an input supplier? What information and how useful is that other essentially than to a soil taxonomist? Which is why we focused on looking at information that can help take decisions. So that is that exact same area, but here looking at soil organic carbon to 30 centimeters depth in the land. That can help guide better decisions. Also, in terms of soil erosion prevalence. Here you see the frequency of erosion in those areas. And so when we look to some of those landscapes in East and Southern Africa, such as this one, they're in a state of near collapse. We've overmined them. And if we're going to be looking at fruit and vegetable production, we've got to target those areas where we feel interventions will have that greatest opportunity. Which is why you can go to ICRAF's portal, GeoPortal, and pull down all of this information for free on root depth restriction, on pH, on soil organic carbon, to help take those decisions for interventions, for hotspots, for co-locating our work together. So we've grown all of these fruits and vegetables, but we also have to cook them. And we almost completely ignore the 1.6 billion cubic meters of firewood in Africa that is used to cook cereals and vegetables and for heating. And even at a very conservative estimate of $50 per cubic meter, that's $80 billion a year value. And what of these food markets? Will we be saving Africa's poor by them marketing vegetables in Tesco's and Asda and Walmart in the north? Well, today's African urban markets are about 3 times the export agriculture markets at about $50 billion a year. And by 2030, it's going to be 10 times. And that's where our focus should be, on the urban African consumer and not on the export markets. And so how will we take those smallholders and engage them in those domestic markets? Well, here's a very simple change of theory, 5-stage framework, if you like, for smallholder agricultural livelihoods, where people start out with subsistence agriculture, move to subsistence agriculture plus safety nets, to pre-commercial agriculture, to profitable smallholder agriculture, and lastly, sustainable smallholder agriculture. And so we use interventions and policies and evidence and materials to move people through that theory of change, and also to stop them sliding backwards, because otherwise they'll end up in urban slums. And in that subsistence agriculture, a lot of that is slash and burn. It is conversion of forest areas. And our latest results show that it's not just only a change in land use, but these are the amount of nutrients that are lost when we burn that forest. And it's only really sulfur that we get back again. Which is why it was very interesting 6 months ago when the latest TEEB study came out, co-published by Trucost, that reminded us that the total world GDP, about 6% of it was agriculture, about $4.2 trillion a year. But when we added up the top 100 negative externalities of business, the economic costs of greenhouse gas emissions, loss of natural resources, etc., that equated to $4.7 trillion just from the top 100, which means agriculture is not profitable. Stop doing it. If you want to zoom down on any of those individual businesses, take cattle ranching in South America. We record on the positive side that we earn $16.6 billion revenue, but we forget to write down that $312 billion it costs us in natural capital. It's like when you were young, if you grew up in an OECD country, you and your friends decided to make some money, and you told your parents, we're going to sell 50 glasses of lemonade at 10 cents a glass, and we're going to make a profit of $5. And your parents don't burst your bubble. They don't tell you, but the water and the lemons and the sugar and the paper and everything else cost you $8, and actually you made a loss. Well, it's exactly the same way we approach agriculture. And yet, it is not fruit, tree, or vegetable cultivation that are contributing to those negative externalities. It is those cereals and livestock options that we pursue. To our second topic, 1973, when AVRDC was launched. Well, it was the year Pink Floyd launched their album, The Dark Side of the Moon. It was when OECD doubled the price of petroleum, and so there was an oil crisis. It's the year that the Sydney Opera House was opened. The slide there shows, and I don't want to incriminate anyone in the audience, but a hypothetical graduate from Bristol University who just graduated with a BSc in physical geography, was awaiting a job in Canada and overindulged in the post-exam celebrations, and that's just an icon of perhaps what happened to one of those individuals. But more seriously, in 1973, there were only 3.9 billion people on the planet. We've added another 3.3, and we're going to add another 3.3 in the next 40 years. We've emitted 200 billion tons of carbon. We've lost 60 million hectares of the Amazonian rainforest. And most worryingly, 400 million children under the age of 5 have died. 180 million preventable from malnutrition. Staggering. What about fruit in 1973? Well, there were only 2 species of fruit that made it into the top 20 commodities, and they were pretty far down the list, and it was only apples and bananas. Now, about that time in 1973, there was a lot of work carried out in New Zealand, where I was an undergraduate, on kiwi fruit. And kiwi fruit didn't make it to the top 20. It today is still only just makes it into the top 50. But what you see over that 40-year period is a change for a fruit tree species from almost nothing up to 1.5 million metric tons a year production. And where did that come from? Well, New Zealand did start it out. In the 1970s, there was a small export market post-World War II. And then development of a lot of technology. Disease-resistant rootstocks, better production techniques, a lot of information on the management, the profitability. And New Zealand launched, they cornered the market. But it was only a 6-month market. And you think, well, then Italy and France and Greece came on board and really competed. Well, they didn't compete, they complemented. So Chile and New Zealand produced kiwi fruit for 6 months of the year, and France, Greece and Italy produced it for the other 6 months of the year. And there's a complementarity there in terms of supply and seasonality, up to the 1.5 million tons production we have per year. But these are all developed countries. What of developing countries? And one of our problems is we always hold kiwi fruit up as that example. Oh, there's another kiwi fruit out there. Well, there's probably not. But there's a whole lot of second and third string species that can still contribute significantly. So let's look to the tropics. Okay, it's flowers, it's not fruit. But Kenya went in 1973 from no flower industry to today to supplying 38% of the cut rose market in Europe, still with an annual growth of 5% a year. Floriculture accounts for 2% of Kenya's GDP and employs 90,000 workers. But it didn't happen by accident. What was behind that? It was not only the favourable climate and productive workforce, but also a combination of large, medium and small growers acting together. High investments in computerized irrigation, grading, infrastructure, recycling systems, lighting, and refrigerated trucks. That's what it took to turn it from 0 up to 38%. To our third topic, a few facts about fruit. Well, fruit come from across a wide variety of botanic families, genera, habitats, and life history traits. They have high cultural and social acceptance. They provide energy and water and vitamins and antioxidants and micronutrients and fiber. They're seldom dominated by men, often gender empowering for women and women's groups and children. They also provide nuts, carbohydrates, oils, and extracts. They're good as vegetables are for both home consumption and marketing. And they can be eaten fresh or dried, extracted, and stored. So there's a quiz now for everyone in the audience, just to wake you up as it's still early in the morning. Largest fruit in the world? Close, a relative. It's the jackfruit. Up to 50 kilograms for an individual fruit. The world's most expensive fruit? The Yubari melons, where an individual pair of melons can retail for up to $26,000 for 2 fruit. The world's most popular fruit? Tomatoes. 160 million tons a year. The fruit with the largest market? It's grapes because of wine. $40 billion a year. The oldest domesticated fruit, and we know that cereal domestication started 10,000 years ago. So which fruit was domesticated first? Figs. 11,500 years ago in the Jordan Valley. 11,500 ago. Predates cereal domestication, fruit. And the largest fruit consumers in the world? Not far wrong, insects. A few other facts about fruit. Well, yes, there is a CGR institute with a mandate for fruit, and that is ICRAF, but it is incredibly worrying, the degree of investment in vegetables. You know, it's probably 3, 4, 5 times less than it should be. And the same occurs in relation to fruit. So to our fourth topic, fruit trees for today. Well, in the context, certainly of Africa, it's largely about moving from wild harvesting to cultivation. And if you think you have problems with your vegetables, think about what we have to do in terms of fruit tree domestication. Understanding mating systems and controlled pollinations can occur 30, 40, 50 meters above the forest floor. Collecting pollinators, insects, pests is a little more precarious than cereal or vegetable domestication. When we carry out range-wide collections, and this was the first range-wide collection of any species across the Amazon, a full range-wide collection, it was over 1 million square kilometres. Over 1 million square kilometres, a 4-year effort. To get to some populations, it was a 5-week trip by boat just to get to the population, with 10 to 15 technical staff, and then collection of a very small amount of seed to bring back for testing and inclusion in the gene bank. We often get very creative as well in terms of assessing those once we've planted them out. Such as here with a mobile tree assessment platform in Sri Lanka. CIMMYT can multiply 20,000 accessions of wheat in 3 hectares. 20,000 accessions. We would require more than 500,000 hectares to do the same job. This is a single multiplication plot for a single accession of a tree. And if we were to keep the isolation distance, the minimum pollination distance between those of 400 meters, you can imagine the amount of land that we would need to regenerate and satisfy those kind of conditions that the international treaty and the trust and the commission expect ICRAF to do for trees, and I'm sure AVRDC to do for vegetables. So when we look at those trees, and particularly fruit trees, we first go to farms to understand what is the demand. And when we look at species accumulation curves across farms in Africa, here for Cameroon, worryingly we find in relation to firewood and medicinal and other species that fruit has a very low accumulation in terms of number of species. And that is repeated across other locations, Uganda, in Western Kenya, and around Mount Kenya. That fruit is often one of those species that is lowly cultivated on farms, and yet it is a high priority, and farmers largely wild harvest it. So changing that from the wild harvest into cultivation is a key aspect for us. And trying to fit that to the needs of people. So here, this shows a range of species in the Miombo in southern Africa, where during the hungry and the cropping season here, you can see there's a wide range of fruit tree species that can fruit and provide nutrition. And that enables us not just to go for a single species, but a portfolio of species that enable to fill that food and income gap. And so we looked in 1973 at apples and bananas as being the only fruit tree species that made it to the top 20. So what makes it to the top 20 40 years later? Well, it's only grapes and mangoes that sneak in. And so one of the problems, this comes from FAO data, which has its own health warning, but one of the problems is we don't have data. We don't have that information on cross-border trade and marketing. There's a single species that is traded between Cameroon and Nigeria, $75 million a year. Just the kernels of one species of one fruit that is completely below the radar screen. And when we look then at the consumption, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and in South Asia, those are the areas where we currently are way below WHO recommended levels. And Jackie introduced that yesterday as the 400 grams. And whether half or 3/4 of that comes from vegetables, there's still a big gap. And there'll still be a projected big gap here, as shown here, in 2030. And that's the need, South Asia and Africa, where fruits and vegetables can have that great impact. And why is it important to have that impact? Well, this slide here from Southern Africa shows what happens and your chance of falling below the poverty line depending on whether you have access to indigenous fruits in the wild. So during January and February and February and March, when your new crop is developing but you're most hungry, if you don't have access to indigenous fruits, there's a high chance that you're going to fall below the poverty line. Whereas if you do have up to 42% of your minimum food requirement can come from indigenous fruit, or even up to 80% for children, there's an enormous difference in your likelihood of falling below the poverty line. So what are the problems we face when we look to change that? Well, this is our problem analysis of low fruit consumption, that we do have suboptimal fruit consumption. It's between 35 and 55 grams per day in East and Southern Africa. And that insufficient production and consumption comes from poor germplasm, poor skills, poor farm management, poor market access, a lot of pests and diseases, and poor soil. And how we go about changing that, I assume you could almost change fruit there for vegetables in sub-Saharan Africa. And so our approach to food security and nutritional security from fruit trees is around that availability, access, use, and okay, we've left stability off because we feel that we've got to make things more available. And we're not apologizing at all for focusing on production, access to quality planting material, access to for different species, dietary diversity, and better on-farm management, access to markets for enterprises, value addition, and linking those farmers to markets. And that consumption information that will help drive a lot of awareness and advocacy. We publish a lot of material on those, books on those, and still the investment doesn't come. The nutritional composition, linking up with nutritionists and health sector to understand the role and opportunities for antioxidants, for micronutrients, for vitamins, whether those are the water-soluble vitamins that you have to take regularly or the fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamin A that you can take more irregularly. We lack the production economic data, such as shown here for one species from West Africa, on the differences and varieties that exist. To keep the youth in the countryside, the research on prices, markets, volumes, actors, margins and timing of that, to be able to make some of those decisions on investments. On looking at market feasibility of various enterprises, if you've got a surplus of one fruit and it's lying on the ground, the temptation is to transform that into a jelly or a jam. Well, you just might have a bit more of an expensive surplus if you go about doing that without understanding the market for that transformed product. Fruit trees are most amenable to vegetative propagation techniques and differences in cuttings and layering and grafting and budding. This is research that we do during the process of domestication. We also don't apologize for technical packages. We've seen a lot of move away from technical support. And yet our website, we have 110,000 visitors a month for information on where to plant, what to plant, which to plant, and how to plant tree species around the tropics. To our fifth example, fruit tree species examples. There's a prize of a return trip for two to Mombasa, if you can tell me that species. The scientific name is named after the sound you make when you clear your throat in Madagascar after you've eaten the fruit. It is Paka. So it is Paka kirkiana. And it's one of the species, the icons, that was funded actually by a BMZ project, Wolfgang, early in the mid to late 90s. And it is a species, it's an impact story that is interesting in terms of writing it up. We looked at that difference between home consumption and sale and the kind of poor quality material that existed in the wild. 2/3 of trees were such horrible quality, tiny fruits, horrible, miserable tasting. Yes, if there was a drought and there was famine, you would eat it. It wasn't really acceptable. And only about 7% were really high quality trees. And those were the ones that were most prized for sale, for local sale, for urban sale, and even cross-border sale. We did participatory selection with a number of communities and villages to find superior Urpaka, or as the local name indicates, Masuku trees. And there was enormous variation between those, more than 5-fold variation between the largest and the smallest fruit. And not only in those, but in terms of sugar content, 7-fold variation between the sugar content of those individual trees, even 2 to 3-fold variation at the population level. And it's a species that can be used both as a fresh market idiotype, although it only has a shelf life of 4 or 5 days, which we can extend to beyond a month, and also a processing, a market type for transformation. And what did we do? With those communities, we developed new cultivars. We took it from a 10-gram fruit and turned it into a 75, 80-gram fruit through just simple horticultural techniques in a very small number of years. Let's jump to another example in West Africa, the African plum that we'd shown you earlier. Again, enormous variation in that species, taking vegetative propagules, whether marcots, cuttings or grafts, transforming those into something that can be marketed. Doing a lot of characterization, not only of that species, the Dacryoides, but also Avingia, the species that has a trade in its kernel alone of $75 million a year between Cameroon and Nigeria. To look at the differences between the fruit and the kernel opportunities. And look at the case of Avingia, that variation in the graph here. The enormous variation that we have to work for in terms of the flesh mass versus the kernel mass. And the kernels are what gives a lot of that sliminess to soups and stews in West Africa. And the timing of that, because it comes onto the market all at once, but this was a cultivar that we developed that fruited around Christmas time, which is why we called it Noel cultivar. And the fruit of a single tree could give $20 income because it was out of season. To a drier part of Africa, to the Sahel, Vitellaria paradoxa, the species of shea butter. It occurs across the Sahel into Sudan, Ethiopia, and northern Uganda, where it is used for cosmetics, but also as a fat. It is largely a woman's enterprise. The kernels are boiled 3 times. There's an enormous consumer of fuel wood, but it is an income that is largely controlled and managed by women. And what we did was to look at standardizing and grading of what was produced, because it was largely suboptimal and they weren't earning a lot of money from it. There are 2 value chains in shea, both the shea butter and the kernel. And most of the trade in West Africa is in the kernel, for export at least. Each woman has access to about 40 trees. Those are with crude grading and for quality. They are used for sale as kernels. About 50 kilograms is used for sale, about 100 processed to butter for sale, and about 200 grams to process for household use. And that gave women about $50 per hectare, per annum. $50. A very important part of income, even though it is small. And just through better post-harvesting, better grading, and better processing, that income could be increased by 50%, without any domestication at all of the fruit, but by understanding that fruit value chain. Let's jump to another dry area in East Africa, where we did a lot of surveys on dryland fruits, not for marketing, but for home consumption, where during periods of drought, it is only the trees that keep livestock and people alive. And so it was about understanding the fruiting periods of those trees, the acceptability, how would we go about cultivating those so that they would survive and be there for periods of drought. Species such as Bichemia, Boschia, Carissa, etc. And so, Dyno, to our last topic, looking to more fruitful landscapes. Climate-smart agriculture is one of those approaches that has been posed by both the World Bank and FAO in 2010. Essentially, they said to the environmentalists, you've tortured us for the last 15 years since Kyoto, and climate change is not just an environmental problem, it's a development problem. And if we are to have climate-smart agriculture, first and foremost, we've got to have increases in income and production. And if we have that, then we can think about adaptation and reducing emissions and sequestration. So we're testing that hypothesis, such as here in Western Kenya. We have 9 10,000 hectare blocks. And with FAO and Finnish funding, we're looking at the opportunities to simultaneously increase productivity and reduce that environmental footprint. Working with farmers, raising awareness, testing, putting a lot of attention into monitoring and evaluation. To try and change things at the landscape level. So what is our landscape? Not only in East Africa, but also throughout the world. Well, our global land use, Jackie, can be divided into approximately those 6 things. Our cropland, pastures and rangeland, tree plantations, natural forests, deserts and wetlands. Of course, it doesn't occur in those proportions. It's more akin to that in terms of area. And if you want to add the urban area where more than 50% of us live, it's that little slither, grey slither down there at the bottom. But of course, that's not what our landscape looks like. It looks like this. It's a mosaic intertwined together. So how do we think we could manage that just by isolating forest, or just by isolating cropland, or just by isolating wetlands? It is that management of that land together that we seek through these landscape approaches. So what is the best way then to optimize those goals of productivity and income, sequestration, reducing emissions and resilience, and environmental goods and services? Well, if you agree that we shouldn't take the silo approach and keep agriculture and forestry and environment separate, why is it that the mechanism we use to address those, such as climate smart agriculture and RED and payments for environmental services, do we put into that silo approach? And if we are seeking those 4 goals of productivity and income, reducing emissions, sequestration and adaptation together, well, if you have those 4 variables, those are the 16 possibilities. And we're deluding ourselves if we think that we're going to have the win-win-win-win-win situation everywhere. It only occurs 1 out of 16 times just statistically, not even in terms of likelihood. And so maybe something, 0 grazing of ruminants will give us 3 wins. Maybe some fertilized maize on poor soils will give us 2 wins. There are very few opportunities that will give us the acceptable 4 wins or 3 wins. And I would contend that in many cases it will be fruit trees and vegetables that give us that opportunity for the quadruple win. And we need to showcase that and provide the evidence to back up investments in that area. And if we are to manage this rural landscape in a more integrated way, what do we do with those smallholders? It was a key topic of discussion yesterday. So imagine today we have approximately 500 million smallholders in the developing world. And perhaps by 2040, that will be transformed into 600 million families. And I would argue that 250 million of those will continue to be smallholders as we view them today. 100 million will progress to be medium holders. 50 million will become rural, landless families. 50 million families, not people, families. And 200 million will move to the urban areas. And so how, as we think of that theory of change, from subsistence to subsistence plus safety nets to pre-commercial agriculture to profitable smallholder agriculture, are we going to be helping to manage that landscape in an integrated way? Well, when we look to Africa, we don't have that demographic problem that Asia and Europe has of the aging population, that is an enormous young, vibrant population. And that can be engaged if there's good opportunities. And vegetables and fruit provide those through income, through new opportunities, through development of enterprises. We also need to remind ourselves that the women's status and control over resources is changing, both in terms of expectation and management. We can't just pay lip service to it as we seek these integrated landscape approaches. Which is why ICRAF, as one of the CGR institutes and championed by Jackie Ashby here, is trying to transform the way in which we mainstream gender into our research, into our monitoring and evaluation frameworks. And is a key dimension, as was shown in terms of the income opportunities for women here. So in terms of process, in terms of outputs, and in terms of impact. So tools for gender mainstreaming in research, training and staff capacity, budget and financial resources for gender mainstreaming, and gender awareness are crucial to get your processes right. In terms of outputs, gender integration and research outcomes, gender integration in programs and projects, and partnerships with gender-relevant delivery partners. So that we can achieve that impact, okay? So that there is gender equality, but not just gender equality, because we're not looking to disempower or disenfranchise men, but we're after gender synergy of men and women together working for profitable enterprises. And vegetables and fruit are some of the best examples to enable that gender mainstreaming. But we face challenges. How do we tackle poverty, social inclusion, development in areas that are challenged with climate change? Well, we have many tools available to us. Biomolecules. And this is one of the best biomolecules that we have to be able to address those challenges. Anyone know what it is? It's called chlorophyll. It's that marvelous pigment that enables us to take CO2 and water out of the atmosphere and transform it into sugar, to change it for fiber, for protein, for energy, for systems, for micronutrients, to be able for those plants to grow. Remember 4.5 billion years ago when these two rocks in space collided and created Earth? We were a rock. We were just a rock. 1 billion years later, when the first self-replicating chemicals with the earliest forms of life emerged. 350 million years ago, trees emerged. And when trees emerged, temperatures were 10 degrees hotter than they are today, and CO2 concentrations were 10 times what they were today, 4,000 parts per million. And it was trees that transformed our environment and made it habitable. And many of these challenging places, it would be trees that provide that habitat, that framework for change and development. And you know what? That architecture and structure is a great place for shade-tolerant vegetables. And so how will we address this development using our knowledge that we generate? Well, our typical impact pathway looks something like this, that the boffins, and you have many boffins here, and I say that very respectfully at AVRDC, that generate and validate knowledge. And then we hand the baton over to another organization, CARE, World Vision, Save the Children, Oxfam, TechnoServe, to apply that knowledge. And yet, that division between research and development that we spoke about yesterday, the discovery science versus the delivery science, is false. Because that production and validation of knowledge and the proof of concept studies cannot be removed from the follow-on pilot project or the development program that we seek to implement. And so we see as much research being needed inside that development process, beyond proof of concept, if you like, to proof of application. Because we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we keep asking questions about the why and the what and the where and the when? When it comes to the how, it's just a best bet, a good practice, a guideline that we use. And yet those principles of research that we were trained on, yes, we are, in one sense, the monkey in the cage eating the banana, but those principles, those banana eating skills that we have, can be transformed in other ways. So taking our paradigm of the researchers develop and validate knowledge and hand it over to somebody else to develop it, to provide that proof of value for money of that original research investment, has to change. We need to move beyond from research to proof of application so we can achieve those more advanced development states. And so looking forward, Dyno, how do we do that for fruit? Well, looking from our producer to production, to product, to processing, to marketing, to consumer framework that informs each other, there are a large number of questions that we need answers to. But we need to do that within the context of delivery. Simultaneous testing of mini pilots and knowledge to see how farmers adapt to it, to learn from it. We're dealing with highly complex systems. And not only are they complex, they're diverse, they're dynamic, and they're unpredictable. So those who are pushing us in the theory of change to forecast everything in advance, well, if you could do that, why would you need to do research in the first place? And yes, it's good to be able to frame and write down your hypotheses and link your outputs to your outcomes, to your impacts. But go anywhere in the developing world, and farmers are far more interested in incomes than in outcomes. And so, how will we address these nutrition-sensitive value chains for fruits? It will be through testing of new varieties. It will be looking at how we manage the land, how we pick and store and develop and build up that infrastructure, and linking those marketing pathways and engaging the youth, and also making sure that they are gender responsive. But it's not going to work everywhere, and it's not going to work well everywhere. And so we have to be very careful that we're not placing communities and farmers at risk as well. The World Agroforestry Centre, ICRAF, we're very happy to share our fruit work with AVRDC, and indeed we're happy to share some of our tomato breeding successes with AVRDC, presented humbly here in this slide. But with more seriousness, fruit and veg do make a great partnership. And the 5 points I would like to leave you with, Dyno, and the board of AVRDC, is that I think AVRDC and ICRAF, we need to co-locate some of our fruit and vegetable work more. Share ideas, intelligence, and analyses. To advocate together for greater investments. We have a 3- or 4-fold underinvestment in fruit and vegetable work that needs to be changed. How can we get that message out there together? To be able to provide that evidence, agree on common monitoring evaluation frameworks, and put a lot more attention into that and the communication of it. And to seek some of those shared investments together, from the pools that we fish in terms of the donors, investors, and the ones that you finish in. And so lastly, to everyone in the audience, I would like to remind you, the people who plant fruit trees live longer. They have more friends, and they enjoy a better love life. And if you don't believe me, then try it and see. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tony. My selection of Tony as a keynote speaker at this workshop, I think, has not disappointed people. Very grateful for the fact that he was willing to come and to make sure that his speech interleaved appropriately with our interests, and I think that he has demonstrated that. And if there's anything in the old adage that a problem shared is a problem halved, then I'm feeling a bit better this morning now than I was before this speech started. We have half an hour. I would prefer that questions come one by one rather than the block version. So who'd like to ask the first question? Maureen.
Thank you very much for your talk and letting us know that insects like fruit as well as vegetables. We feel better about that. I'd like to ask you about the possibility of using permaculture for vegetables and how that might work with fruit trees.
Okay. One of the techniques I've learned at Denmark is to... So one of the techniques I've learned at Copenhagen University is to ask the question, do you have an answer to your own question?
I don't, no. but you know, when you're talking about trees and they're a very permanent fixture of the landscape, vegetables are typically annuals. You have to cultivate the soil, and that has its own issues. So would it be possible to use perennials as vegetables and incorporate those into fruit production systems?
One of the issues we face with all trees is that farmers don't adopt tree cultivation. They test. Because if you're growing tomatoes or carrots or wheat or sunflower, if you don't like it, you can change next year. But if you start cultivating perennials, they'll be there a very long time, and they're quite difficult to dig up and replace. So we see farmers test and then expand. And farmers can plant what is available. And so often we see being able to drive that diversity is done through nursery operators and through a lot of education and awareness. I know there's movements as well to look for at perennials for their, or trees, for their ability to perennialize some of our annuals, both fruits and vegetables. Both cereals and vegetables. There are a number of tree species that have leafy vegetables, leaves. Vernonia is a good example. Moringa, something that you already work on already. Pterocarpus. Baobab is a fantastic leafy vegetable. And so I think the opportunity for perennials to provide those leafy vegetables as well as the fruit and the infrastructure and the diversity, you know, we find 90% of terrestrial diversity in forests because of that framework species. And we often look to birds and butterflies as indicators of diversity, or termites. Well, trees are a great indicator of diversity because they provide a framework for many other things and ecosystems to flourish and thrive together. So the opportunity for permaculture with trees to provide leafy vegetables and others is there. But again, it is about acceptance, about awareness. In West Africa, people eat baobab leaves. In East Africa, people die with leaves of baobab on trees. They're culturally not used to, they're not aware of recipes, how to treat it. There are some social and cultural taboos associated with those. And so it is going to take a while to change.
Jackie's next.
Tony, for a very intriguing and stimulating talk. You've presented, and it doesn't originate with you, I think there is a case to be made that fruit and vegetables together could be a very powerful program for inclusive development, for climate smart agriculture. And we've been talking around in this last couple of days about how it's clearly, under-resourced in terms of the potential that's there. It'll be interesting to hear maybe both of you reflect on, what are the pros and cons of maybe putting forward a proposal for a global fruit and vegetable program. There's a new call for proposals coming up with the CG research programs, and a new call for proposals coming up now in 2014. Or maybe you don't need the CGIR to do it. There are other ways to go forward. But it'd be interesting to hear your reflections on what are the pros and cons of that.
Yes, it is very worrying. I don't know enough about AVRDC, but I was very much struck when I came here and very felt for the board and management and staffers that you are neglected and underappreciated, and how we change awareness, understanding, recognition, and then investment in something that is so worthy and so vital. It's perplexing, actually, that AVRDC struggles, and we also struggle to get the fruit dimension of our work more thoroughly covered. We face strong pressures Gates and USAID believe you can solve the world's problems by better cereal seeds and more artificial fertilizers. And you saw from those land degradation maps in Africa that that is oversimplistic. And yet we like these oversimplistic portrayals of theories of change and impact and returns on investments. And I think we've got to step up and realize that there's a not just a knowledge gap, but a data gap. We've got to provide the case more thoroughly with strong evidence of the linkages and how much we can change vitamin and micronutrient availability, how we can change incomes. The Millennium Villages Project and Jeff Sachs have received a lot of criticism recently because they had a very evangelistic and very positive and optimistic spin on how to change the world, at least in African villages. But because of lack of evidence, because of strong monitoring and evaluation, they're falling foul of a lot of fair and unfair criticism. And I think together we, Dyno, have to make sure that we are collecting and keeping that information up there. But that costs money to collect. FAO don't keep statistics on it, people don't publish it, and yet it is a vital part of human nutrition and even the cultivation of those. So every opportunity, whether it's climate smart agriculture or landscape approaches or investment or sustainable development goals and income, we've got to make sure that we can adapt and apply the message and not just keep on our tomato leaf curl virus story. You know, we've got to change and adapt it. But I think if we can't do it, we can't expect anyone else to do it. And we've got to change something because what we've been doing to date hasn't worked well enough. So we will try and experiment. And I think those 5 points at the end of co-locating our work, agreeing on standards for monitoring and evaluation, providing that evidence, looking for shared investment, sharing opportunities and ideas and ways of cracking this old chestnut. But if you have any other ideas, please share for Dyno and I.
Amy's next, and then we're going to have Port the rest.
Thanks, Tony, for a great presentation. You emphasized a lot of sort of the fresh market and fresh consumption for fruits, and you also emphasized kind of the unknown, at least the less familiar fruits and vegetables. And yet, even in Africa, much of the interest in sort of planting trees is actually with fairly standard fruits, mangoes, oranges, lemons, limes, etc. How do you see the future of fruit as the foundation for a processing industry, for juices, for purees, for yogurt flavorings, for fruit leather, for sweets, etc.? How do you see that sort of market developing in Africa?
So 2 questions there, one on fresh versus transformed and the other on opportunities. The Camden and Chorleywood Food Research Association, which is based in the UK, is the largest independent food research institute in the world. They have 350 food technologists working on various products, and there's about 1,800 food manufacturers sign up and pay an annual subscription to that. They are looking for flavors, tastes, novelty, new opportunities, because the world is sick of drinking orange juice. For breakfast cereals, for nutrient, for health food snacks, etc. But remember, that is again around export agriculture. If we look at mangoes as an example, the horticultural industry started in Kenya in the mid-1960s. And it was started with German development assistance. It was a chap called Jürgen Griesbach, okay? And he came out as a middle-aged German scientist and brought in a whole lot of materials from all around the world. And he decided, well, where can I keep these where I have abundant labor, secure facilities, and lots of land for the mother blocks? And he put them into the prison farms in 1960. And then they were largely, when the project finished, they were largely forgotten about. And in the early to mid 1990s, I sent one of my staff members at the time when I just joined ICRAF to prison for 2 years. Well, he went around all of the prisons and resurrected these varieties because they were still there. And yet, although you could only buy 2 varieties on the roadside in supermarkets, there were more than 30 varieties that were export quality, and even some unique African and Kenyan varieties that had been developed. And so we saw mango production go from about 20,000 tonnes a year to 600,000 tonnes a year. But still today, only about 6,000 tonnes of mangoes are exported outside of Kenya. Most is for domestic consumption in those urban markets. And I think, remember that by 2030, 10 times more food is going to be sold in African urban markets than is exported. And that's where our orientation should be. What will those people, African urban consumers, want to consume? And a lot of that's going to be based around education and awareness and what they ate as children and bringing it in. So as much as the Helen Keller is bringing vegetables to schools and nutrition packs, I think fruit as well. World Food Programme is also asking us to team up with them so that they don't only provide cereal relief when there's floods and droughts, but what will the things be able to provide to refugees so that they can not only cook their food but also have guavas and mangoes and vitamin C and vitamin A arising from those. We have to be careful though that we don't, there's so many species to deal with. UK has 35 native species of tree. The whole of Western Europe, 250 species of tree. North America, 600 species of tree. Just Kenya has 1,800. We have so many to deal with. And that's part of our challenge. And putting resources that we put into rice or wheat or maize, we can't put into a single fruit. So how do we shortcut? How do we accelerate that process of development and discovery and new planting materials to satisfy some of that market pull? But the wonderful thing about fruit is, if the world price for coffee crashes, it's useless. They can't feed it, they can't use it. Farmers, it has no value at all to farmers. But if you're growing mangoes or alpaca or dacryoides or ricindendron or shea or tamarind, if you can't sell it, at least you can eat it, or you can dry it and eat it later during a period of drought. So I think that the do no harm aspect of fruit tree cultivation, I think provides enormous opportunities.
Beth Mitchell.
Yes, hi, Beth Mitchell. I'm the director of the Horticulture CRISP program, and I had a comment and then a follow-up question. I wanted to go back to what Jackie was asking about in terms of advocacy for horticulture. And just, the Horticulture CRISP program, I think, represents a small part, maybe a large part of USAID's investment in horticulture, which is way too small. And we're a much smaller program than either of your two programs, but we focus on both fruits, vegetables, and to some extent ornamentals. I'd just like to say that perhaps what we need is for the various organizations that focus on horticulture crops, including the Global Horticulture Initiative, should perhaps work together in advocacy to try to get the message out better in all terms of gathering together the evidence and looking at what evidence we each have, because I'm sure we each have different evidence to bring to the table. So I'm very happy to participate in that if there's interest. Then my question, though, is, so as Horticulture CRISP, we're a new program. We're just in our first 5 years. And I've found that in terms of the kind of projects we've ended up funding, the majority of them deal with vegetable crops. And the reason that has happened is because many of the proposals we received related to fruit crop production either were export oriented, which we tend not to emphasize as much, or didn't show a good connection to female opportunities. So we're really interested in promoting projects that will empower women. So I'd really like to hear, Tony, a little bit more about your assessment of the situation in terms of opportunities for women in the production and then post-harvest handling of fruit.
It's interesting. Certainly, the tree species that we work on. So I'll take your second question first. That we work on are not monopolized by women, but largely controlled by women. And even where there's income-generating opportunities, men don't seek to, because it is small amounts of money that comes regularly. It's not cocoa, which comes once a year. It's one check, and it comes once a year. And I think that those regular labor-involving aspects, like fruit and fruit tree transformation, particularly if you're dealing with a number of species, will provide some of that protection. If you look at, if you look at a cereal farmer in Europe or North America, they have this huge piece of machinery called a combine harvester, and it's only used for 3 weeks a year, and it costs $250,000, and you drive it and you park it in the shed for the other 49 weeks of the year. And it's the same for those industries like cocoa. So there's this enormous machinery, the grading, the drying, the transporters, the warehousing, that is used only largely once a year in West Africa. And so what is all of that, and when that income comes, it is largely sequestered by men. But what is that infrastructure and whole system doing for the rest of the year? And that provides the opportunity for the marketing, the transformation, the storage, the development of fruit tree species, of other things, and to engage women. And I think that routine and regular use for home consumption and for income, for home consumption, being able to take decisions on how you allocate resources to those is better controlled and better managed by female-headed households or women from joint households. In terms of advocacy and where we are with global horticulture, in 2004 and 2005 there was an initiative to develop a kind of a fruit and vegetable or horticultural CRP. And I think it's struggled because it was largely institutionalized. And the then Director General of AVRDC and CIRAD kind of tried to, not steal a march, but tried to control it. And I think if we institutionalize horticulture and attach it to certain institutions or one group or body, that's where we will struggle. And there's only when collectively we kind of, even for no money, we would like to link up and be doing things together. We'll be found out for doing that, rather than going for a donor and saying, we need that money. I think we have to change some of our behaviors and the way that we collaborate and the way that we framework, rather than claiming ownership or space for it. And landscapes, as an example, has kind of almost died because of that, because people want to own the term landscape, and yet it's a bit fuzzy and there's no UN definition of it, and it doesn't translate well into other languages, and it's a noun, it's not a very active thing. And so we have to be careful with horticulture that it doesn't fall foul of the same difficulties. But we, as a past sinner, ICRAF and myself, we would like to reach out, and I think the gesture from AVRDC to involve ICRAF and to involve fruit and to try and work more collectively is a good sign towards that. And certainly Horticultural CRISP and GHI and CIRAD and others, we need to get our acts together and work collectively.
Time for one more question. Who's it going to be? David Samuels.
Thank you, Tony, for a really remarkable presentation. I'm particularly interested in the relationship between the work of ICRAF and the work of AVRDC and ways of finding synergies and commonalities. And as I've been sitting listening to the conversation, it occurs to me that perhaps using the term fruit versus vegetables is getting in our way. The dichotomy is a bit false. Most of the crops that we work with here that we call vegetables are, at least in a botanical sense, are fruits, with the exception, of course, of root crops and leafy greens. The difference between the crops that you're concerned with and the crops that we're concerned with is that ours are mostly annuals and yours are mostly perennials. And it occurs to me that we might want to think about smart agriculture, integrated research production systems and so forth in terms of the way we can bring together production systems that integrate perennials with annuals. And this would be a way for us really to join forces in a creative and productive sort of way. And I just want to suggest that and see what sort of response you might have to that suggestion.
No, it is an excellent suggestion. 5 years ago, Nemanga and Gongi presented the Agri Plan for Africa for agricultural crop improvement. And it was all around cereals, and it was all around the combination then with fertilizers. And there was a private sector person in the audience who challenged him. It was actually Howard Shapiro from Mars. And said, so how many vegetables will you be working with? How many perennials will you be working with? How many non-traditional crops will you be working with? And the answer came back as 0. And he was a bit miffed by that. And having just paid for the sequencing and assembly and annotation of the cocoa genome, he started to make inquiries of what would it take to look at food crops for Africa that would help nutrition, would help address issues of stunting, new market opportunities. And through working with Life Technologies, one of the foremost manufacturers of sequencing equipment, the Beijing Genomics Institute, WWF, and also with ICRAF, we clubbed together, and in December this year, and Molly Jan, who was on your board previously, was involved in identifying some of the crops. In December this year, we will launch the African Crops Consortium. So currently, there are 54 plant taxa that have been fully sequenced. Not all annotated, but fully sequenced. In the next 4 years, we will add to that list an additional 101 plant taxa, more than a third of which are perennials, are trees. And so the opportunities there to accelerate improvement, to have marker-assisted selection, to really fast-track a lot of the development improvements will come from the knowledge base that's going to be derived during that 4-year period. But all that information will be for nothing if we can't get national governments to invest in breeding programs for those key crops. So yes, we will be identify and annotate and find very variable material and productive and disease resistant and others, but unless we can utilize that. And I think that one of the aspects will be shade-tolerant species and finding shade-tolerant vegetables that combine well in integrated systems is a great endeavor that collectively I think that we could work on. I know it's only the start, the African Crops Consortium, but it will be an initiative that hopefully be one of those triggers that helps gather greater investment around the fruit and veg, the greens and the yellows and the reds and the blues and all of those other lovely colours we see.
Tony, if that was a slip of the tongue, it was a good one. You called it the African Crops.
Orphan crops, yeah.
You left out orphan, which is probably the best thing you did because of the label. It will take away the barriers that David introduced in the question. And so I think we should look at that very carefully and go back and talk to Howard. I work for Howard and I work with Tony on that, so that I can speak authoritatively about at least the name.
So, and I also left out NEPAD, which is very important.
Right. So I'd like to thank Tony very much indeed. We've had an interesting discussion. I was sitting there musing while the questions were going on, and I was thinking to myself, when you drive into Champlain in an afternoon and you go past all of those market stallholders, they sell both fruit and vegetables together. And maybe our client group should be market traders, not consumers. And then we can get over these types of things. But I think lots of interesting ideas have come out of this. The potential for synergy is large. The amount of management time available to exploit those synergies is low, but we're going to have to work effectively so that we can, with Beth and with others, we can do more. And I'd like to thank Tony very much indeed. It's a long way to come, and he's given us an excellent talk. It was what I expected, and I much appreciate that. But I think that for AVRDC, we have learned that we have a friend in Kenya, we have a friend in Africa, and let's hope we can then use those friends to both together reach our target groups, which are small, disadvantaged agriculturalists, women farmers, disabled farmers, HIV positive groups, all of these other people, because that's what we're really here for. And let's make sure that the next person that stands up here in 20 years' time doesn't say there are 800 million, too many children dying, etc. We need to do something about it, and I'm impatient to get on with it. Thank you very much indeed. It's coffee.